How did the United States impact Canada's socioeconomic, cultural, and political norms during the Gilded Age? On the topic of immigration, during the 1880s and 1890s, more people left Canada than arrived. 1,600,000 immigrants went to the U.S., and 1,225,000 arrived in Canada from overseas. Canadian National Labour Centrals were first formed in the 1870s and 1880s. Immigration contributed prominently to discussions at annual conventions, in the political lobbying efforts of the Centrals, and in the relations between Canada and the labour movement abroad. The Canadian working class/unionists frequently expressed their rigid hostility toward the importation of contract labor and assisted immigration of paupers. Unionists expressed their ethnocentrism by railing against Europeans who were imported to Canada on contract. Foreign men were sometimes brought in as strike breakers from the U.S., where European immigration was reaching mass proportions. In British Columbia, Chinese men began arriving from California in 1858, when the gold rush was in full swing. Their numbers drastically increased during the 1880s, when contractors from the Canadian Pacific Railway imported construction laborers on contract from China to perform the most dangerous building projects. In the Rocky Mountains, Anglo-Celtic Unionists working in the coal mines of Vancouver Island began to clash with Chinese workers in the 1870s. White Unionists first excluded them from their ranks, and then they began treating them as scab labor. In the late 1880s, organized labor on the West Coast was playing a major part in the fight to exclude Chinese immigrants from entering Canada. In 1885, the year construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway was finished. The white labor movement of British Columbia proudly shared credit for the discriminatory $50 head tax on Chinese people entering Canada, which was the first of many anti-Chinese measures created by the Dominion and provincial governments. Canada adopted a series of public policies and covert practices that amounted to a White Canada policy, which was put into effect during the early 20th century, and was decidedly pushed forward by the Canadian labor movement.
Beginning in the 1880s, roughly 2,000 American fugitives, most of which were clerks, cashiers, and bank tellers, popularly called boodlers, which came to signify corruption and international flight, fled to Canada mainly to avoid embezzlement charges. This was symptomatic to the late 19th century mobility crisis, when embezzlement was a cog in the hypothetical rapidly modernizing mobility machine. When migration to urban areas, the rise of an increasingly mobile middle class, and the growth of international transportation networks were on the rise. Boodlers were some of the earliest white-collar criminals and had a relatively unexpected impact on the evolution of the United States' international borders, both in the popular imagination and in actual law enforcement techniques and surveillance. Most Canada-bound fugitive Americans were wealthy bureaucrats who committed a fraud or financial crime, like bank tellers who were responsible for speculating with borrowed funds, government clerks who emptied city treasuries, or municipal councilmen who accepted bribes. Despite being fugitives, these men were often locally prevalent and extremely conspicuous, as they made little to no effort to conceal their identities, brought their families north with them, and even allowed American journalists to interview them. They were often mere characteristics within a larger social tension in the U.S., a crisis of mobility, cultural apprehensions, and more opportunities for crime began to arise in the 1880s, when this crisis took on an international dimension. New transportation networks and the standardization of paper money, or greenback, made it easier for people, along with capital, to cross borders, which reflected the inclusion of the United States into a larger, more global economy. The boodler crisis began around the same time as technological and economic advances were rapidly occurring, and laws failed to keep up with these changes. Not to mention that the Canadian border was close to the U.S. geographically, and connected firmly through railroad networks to major cities in the Midwest and the Northeast. Although they were usually accused of laughing at the law and disregarding legality as a whole, boodlers acted with a careful consideration of the law and had a deep confidence in it. For them to live out in the open, even when the U.S. desperately wanted them back and Canada wanted to be rid of them, they truly had to believe that both states had no choice but to reluctantly accept the bidding of the extradition treaty. They also exemplified the dialectical relationship between law and lawlessness. Extradition law was meant to bring stability to the international border. Instead, it inadvertently caused and encouraged new crimes. Boodlers didn't represent the breakdown of law at the U.S.-Canadian border. Rather, they exposed the drawbacks of rigid adherence to legalities that couldn't keep up with rapid social transformation.